Hello, sisters. Welcome to the Sacred Medicine Podcast, weaving powerful, soulful practices into functional medicine. Step into this beautiful space of devotion and explore everything from nurturing foods, rituals, sexuality, and awakening your innate sensuality. It is time to own your radiance. This is the Sacred Medicine Podcast. All right, welcome back to another week of the Sacred Medicine Podcast. I am your host, Margaret Romero, and today we have a new guest, Dr. Kyrin Dunston. She is a Board Certified OBGYN for over 20 years and also fellowship trained in anti-aging, metabolic, and functional medicine. So she is someone that is so well-versed in women's health and using holistic and functional medicine. And I wanted to talk all about fibroids because I feel like that's also another common theme that runs through women's lives. It's fibroids. How big are they? How do we get them out? Let's surgically remove them. Let's burn them. Let's freeze them. So today we are talking about unconventional ways of treating fibroids. So we are not talking about surgery. When we talk so much more about the why behind, why women get fibroids, why does it happen? So one of the things that we're going to be talking all about is hormone balance. And we talk all about the different types of hormones and what to be checking routinely. And we also talk about which are the better tests. Is it blood work? Is it a urine test? So we talk about different specialized testing for hormones and also about estrogen dominance, because that's what we primarily see in women who suffer from fibroids, and whether that's giving them progesterone, but it's also addressing some other really key things: heavy metals, toxicity, things like that, and nutritional deficiencies. So we talk really deeply about this. I mean, when was the last time you went to see your OBGYN and they talked about your toxic levels or heavy metals or your B12 levels? I mean, I don't think so. I think they were more like, oh, you have fibroids? Okay, yeah, let's schedule you for surgery. Let's just remove them. So let's combat this in a different way. Let's look at what is causing the fibroids to begin with. If it's estrogen dominance, let's balance out those hormones. Let's get you out of nutritional deficiencies. Let's address all of the toxicities and looking for where they are and what you're actually suffering from. And then we talk about the spiritual aspects of this all. And this may or may not, you may or may not be into it, but there's always some form of energetic or spiritual component to any chronic illness. And so we really talk about that this time. And that's it. I really love this conversation. What a great, great doctor. She's out in Georgia and just practicing what she loves. And I loved it. And we had a really nice connection, and she's really a beautiful person. So I hope you enjoy this interview. I hope you learn a lot, and you write down some notes, bring them to your doctor. And if they're not open to it, which they may not be, because you really have to be trained in this, find yourself a functional medicine practitioner that really practices this type of medicine, and forget the surgery. That's not the only option. That is by far that is not the only thing out there available, but they'll let you think that it is. So don't be fooled by that. There's lots of ways to help with, treat, and shrink fibroids. Without further ado, on to the show. Dr. Dunston, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you for having me, Margaret. I'm very excited to be here.
So why don't we start with, let's start with a quick conventional approach to fibroids, which I know it's pretty much removal, surgical removal. Is that pretty much the conventional way?
Well, the conventional treatment usually starts with birth control pills. So hormonal suppression with birth control pills, which may or may not control symptoms, or they may use Depo-Provera injections, suppress them, because basically it's a symptom-based approach. Since fibroid tumors are 99.8% times benign, usually there isn't big concern about cancer unless they grow very rapidly. If they do grow rapidly, then cancer is a concern. Then we would go straight to removal. But usually hormonal suppression, because fibroids are hormonally mediated, is the first treatment of choice. And then actually there have been some more conservative treatment modalities introduced over the last few decades that you can have uterine artery embolization, where it's done in a radiology procedure, where the arteries that supply blood to the uterus are actually blocked off to decrease blood flow. That's an option. And there's also an option now where you can have imaging guided heat reduction of the fibroids. So they've tried to come up with modalities that are uterus preserving, that will just target the fibroids themselves. And then you can go to surgery. So a myomectomy, where you remove the fibroids, and then hysterectomy is the ultimate treatment, because if there's no uterus, there are no fibroids. So that's kind of the progression of traditional treatments.
Okay. Thanks so much. Which seems to be, all to me sound like especially the latter, very scary approaches to treatment of fibroids. I mean, let's just remove the organ. I mean, it just sounds a little, it just has been turned to such a surgical approach at times to fibroids. But I'd love to learn the more natural approaches, which I think is largely my audience really love to hear more of a holistic approach and functional medicine approach to fibroids.
Yeah, and that's what I love talking about too. Oh, and I didn't mention GnRH agonist. So it's a hormone that can be given to women to shut off the female hormones from the brain. And so that also is another treatment. Now, having said that, my favorite thing to talk about is natural treatments. And that's why I don't practice traditional OBGYN anymore. I practice a functional medicine approach. So with this approach, we look at, why do you have fibroids? So we're not just concerned with getting rid of symptoms and suppressing symptoms. We're interested in, why do you have these, and getting at the root causes. So with any disorder in the body, there are usually four main causes that I target. Number one is hormone balance. Number two is toxicity, which is the same thing as inflammation. Number three is nutritional deficiency. And number four is your intangibles. So mental, emotional, and spiritual balance, and the energetics of the body. So I always start with a hormonal approach. And the first thing that you want to have done if you have been diagnosed with fibroids is to have your sex hormone levels checked, have a complete thyroid profile. And this is not something that your regular doctor will do. They'll just do a TSH maybe and a small profile, but you want to have 8 different parameters of your thyroid checked. You want to look at your insulin, and you want to look at your cortisol, salivary cortisol levels. So I always say there's 7 main hormones that you want to have evaluated, and those are the 3 sex hormones: estrogen, progesterone, testosterone, and then the cortisol and DHEA. DHEA is the backup to cortisol, thyroid, and insulin. So you want to look at all those, because generally people who have fibroid tumors have estrogen dominance, meaning that they have too much estrogen relative to their progesterone. The estrogen and progesterone always need to be in balance. And if you get an imbalance, whether you have too much estrogen or not enough progesterone, and the ratio between the two is abnormal, then you're prone to female dysfunctions like fibroids, endometriosis,
right,
fibrocystic breast cancer, most of the maladies that affect reproductive age women. So you've got to get those hormone levels checked, and then you have to see where the imbalances are and correct them. So if you have too much estrogen, which is very common, I sometimes think we should call ourselves Estrogen Nation, because We are inundated with estrogens in our foods that we eat, the hormones in our livestock, and pesticides can act like estrogens, and plastic residues can act like estrogens in the body. And so most of us have way too much estrogen. So you've got to detoxify that and get it out of the body through the liver and the gut and through the gastrointestinal tract. And then you usually have to balance out the progesterone and improve ovulatory function, because that's what drives your progesterone. And then usually cortisol is not something most people hear about at their regular doctor's office, because we're not taught to check it. But in a functional practitioner's office like yours or mine, we're definitely going to look at your cortisol, because cortisol, your stress hormone, is one of the main reasons why people don't have enough progesterone to balance out their estrogen. So you've got to fix the cortisol and see why it's stressed out. And it's not just life stressors that we think about, right? Psychosocial stressors, but it's physical stressors, right? So gut health problems that you're having, that's stressing out your cortisol, or latent viral infections like Epstein-Barr virus that's so rampant that could be reactivated and affecting your cortisol. And this will directly siphon off your progesterone. They call it the pregnenolone steal. It steals it, and pregnenolone is one of the mother hormones. So it makes progesterone, but if cortisol is stealing it, then you don't make progesterone. So if you've got fibroids, first thing you've got to do is get a comprehensive functional hormone evaluation, and then start addressing those problems.
Now, do you like doing just regular blood work, or do you do the Dutch test? What's your preference?
Oh, well, so blood is not an adequate measure for these hormones, because they are steroid hormones. They're derived from cholesterol, which is fat. Everybody knows cholesterol comes from animal fat, right? And so these hormones are oily, they're fat, and they don't mix well with water. So they're not free floating in your blood. So if you draw blood to try to check the levels, it's kind of like trying to check how much oil is in your salad dressing after you make it. And if it doesn't completely mix, you know that oil and water separate out. So they're actually carried around in proteins, and they don't spend very much time free floating in the blood. So to get an accurate measure, you do need usually urine metabolites like the Dutch profile and or saliva. And so I love the Dutch. It's my favorite test to do to check sex hormones. I also will use some other lab salivary testing methods. But if someone's on hormones, absolutely, you've got to do the urinary metabolites.
Right. Okay. Okay. So this is where we start. We start here. We see what the levels are. You do the test. And typically, do you typically see estrogen dominance in most women that have fibroids across the board?
Pretty much, yes.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay. And then let's say there's imbalances. What's your approach to that? Are you using bioidenticals? How are you changing their diet? What's the first step there?
So usually, well, depending on what the hormones are doing, but in terms of the estrogen dominance, absolutely dietary modification is usually the first step, because we are literally what we eat.
Right.
And we've got to change to a more, most of us in general, plant-based, non-processed, organic, holistic diet. And if you're eating a particularly processed fast food diet high in meat, then changing that to a more earthbound diet is what I would call it, would be the absolute first step. And then there are supplements that you can take to help usher out the excess estrogens from the body. So there are botanicals that you can take to rev the enzymes up in the liver for phase 1 and phase 2 detoxification. Make sure you're pooping. Absolutely. I find that a lot of women who have fibroids are not pooping. And this is probably one of the biggest reasons why they are so estrogen dominant, because your body excretes estrogen. Everything your body makes, it has to get rid of, including estrogen. And so if you don't get rid of it, it can become a toxin. Even though you need it to be healthy, if you're not getting rid of it and it's building up, that becomes a toxin. And if you're not pooping, your body is reabsorbing that estrogen, reabsorbing it. And you can get estrogen dominant. So absolutely that's called phase 3 detoxification. You've got to have the poop flowing. I call it taking out the trash. Got to take out the trash every day, ladies.
Exactly.
Yeah. So mobilizing the proper detoxification and then getting rid of any toxins in the environment that could be exacerbating that, like the soft plastic bottles that we can drink out of that have phthalates. Definitely want to get rid of those. You want to get rid of pesticides. I usually recommend getting rid of coffee and dairy products. These can act like estrogens in the body as well. And some other dietary modifications that can be on a more personal basis. So sometimes I'll do food sensitivity testing to look and see what food someone's sensitive to, because that can exacerbate these issues as well.
What do you think about dairy that's organic?
It's better, but cow's milk can be particularly inflammatory. And that's the next category I usually go to is inflammation, which is a form of toxicity in the body. And you want to look at all the sources of inflammation in the body. And food is a common source of inflammation. If you think about it, we are what we eat. And so if you're eating inflammatory food, you're creating inflammation in your body. And if your body is sensitive to foods that are particularly inflammatory, like cow's milk, dairy, and gluten in particular are universally inflammatory, and a lot of grains are, and we can talk a little bit about why, then getting rid of all sources of inflammation is usually what I go to next, because pretty much any disease process has at its center a driver of inflammation, or usually many drivers of inflammation, including fibroids.
Yes. And I think that's one of the biggest things that I find with my patients is their unwillingness to give up gluten and dairy to begin with. And then if I add on, let's get rid of grains, it sends them into a tailspin. And so sometimes it's hard for people to really follow that to a T.
Yeah, people are pretty resistant to it. I used to be too, until I suffered enough, and then I was willing to do whatever it took to regain my health. And then once I realized how essential this was to me being optimally healthy, and I started enjoying a different diet, I don't miss it. So people are often more wedded to their food habits, their dietary habits, than they are to their religion, believe it or not. And they will defend their right to eat what they eat vehemently. And so where does this come from, and how do you address it? So our dietary preferences, except for a few things, like we are born with a preference for fat and sugar taste, because that confers survival capabilities on us, are really learned. So if you grow up in China, you're going to like certain Chinese spices and flavors. And if you grow up in America, you're going to like certain American spices and flavors. So if you can learn something, you can unlearn something, and you can change it. But that has to come from being motivated to do so. And so I find that people have to have had enough pain, and enough pain that hasn't been resolved by the conventional medical system, to actually be open to looking at the fact that their diet is contributing to their health problems. And then I also find that education is key, because, most people aren't aware that wheat has been genetically engineered over the past 50 to 70 years in our country, so that gluten, which is a form of protein on the wheat molecule, actually has been increased in density, because it confers a certain survival ability on the wheat plant. So whereas there might have been 2 gluten molecules in a certain density of wheat, now there might 50. And why have they done this? They've done it because it makes the wheat seed hardier, that it will last longer in storage. So it can be ported and it can be stored. And then when it's planted, it actually grows more quickly and it's more resistant to pests in the environment, and they can get a greater yield of the wheat per crop area. So for all these economic reasons, they've genetically engineered wheat to have a high density of gluten. And this is why gluten sensitivity is so predominant now. That's why you see it everywhere. And now, why is this? So gluten is very indigestible. If you think about all grains, what are grains? They are seeds, and the intent is to propagate the species of a plant. So animals eat the seeds, and then it goes through their digestive system, and then they go somewhere else and they poop, and that seed goes in the ground and creates a plant. Well, grains have to be resistant to digestive processes to make it, to propagate the species in another area, right? So that is their nature. That's what a grain is. It's a seed that needs to be resistant to digestion. So you eat it and your body has a hell of a time trying to digest it. And now wheat has had gluten 50x in it, and your body has a hard time digesting it. It's very resistant, and that creates inflammation in the body.
Right.
And so when you educate people about this, they go, wow, I had no idea. And so I'm a complete proponent. This is why my visits now with patients are, 1 to 2 hours, is because there's a lot of education that has to go into, versus just a 5-10 minute OBGYN visit. Here, take this pill, which really I think is a disrespect to your intelligence. Because I think the majority of people, when they're properly educated, they say, wow, I had no idea. Wow, I'm going to look at this, eliminating gluten. And you educate them, and then they're willing to make the changes.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Great. Okay, so we're changing their diet. We're making sure they're pooping, getting rid of these toxins, these everyday toxins, looking at really organic foods, no dairy, no gluten. What's the next step?
Well, and then so inflammation and toxicity, it's detoxifying the body. We've talked a little bit about that. And there can be other factors that are causing toxicity and inflammation in the body. That can be chronic viral infections, particularly Epstein-Barr virus is very common. It can be heavy metals. So lots of sources of toxicity. It can be mercury amalgams in the mouth. So you want to get rid of those. So you've got to get rid of all of the sources of toxicity in the body. And then next we look at nutritional deficiencies. So 70% of Americans have micronutrient deficiencies. We're not talking about macronutrients. Most people think of malnutrition and they think of macronutrients. So lack of calories from carbohydrates, proteins, fats. We don't really have that problem in our country, but what we do have is micronutrient deficiencies for a couple reasons. So the food that we eat is highly processed. Our farming practices have decreased nutrient density in the soil. And then the way we prepare our foods, and then also our increased need for micronutrients has increased over the past 50 to 70 years since the Industrial Revolution. So even the RDAs that were set back in the 1950s, we've kept those, but they're really no longer valid. Our nutrient requirements are way higher because of the amount of toxins that our bodies have to process. So you've got to get adequate nutrients on board. And some people will say, well, is a women's 1-a-day vitamin good? No. So you're generally going to be taking about 12 loose fill capsules of micronutrients a day to replace what you're needing and give you adequate supplementation. But you can usually initially people have to go into kind of a repletion phase of 3 months where they're really getting onboarding all of these nutrients. And then they don't have to take such high doses, but usually a women's 1-a-day is totally insufficient. And also some of the commercially prepared vitamins have a lot of toxins in them. So you're actually
Yeah.
more harm to yourself than benefit. So you want a high grade multivitamin nutrient supplement.
Now, for women that have had lots of bleeding from fibroids, what's one of your go-tos to help with that?
Well, you've got to get iron on board, definitely, because you're losing iron. So menorrhagia or heavy menstrual bleeding is the number one cause of reproductive age women. You can overdose on iron, so you definitely want to get your levels checked and see where you are and monitor those as you replace. There are some wonderful supplements that will actually help to slow the menstrual flow in a quick period of time, so you can use them fairly acutely. And then there are more long-term supplements that can help. But as you address these underlying problems, the goal is, so the fibroid tumors are kind of kept alive by the state or the lack of health in your body. So the hormonal imbalances, the toxicities, nutrient deficiencies create them and then propagate them. So if you cut off what's stimulating them to grow and maintain themselves, well, they have no choice but to start shrinking. And so ultimately that is the goal.
And what are your thoughts around giving progesterone to help with the bleeding?
Oh, absolutely. Well, I'm really a test, don't guess kind of person. So
Right.
I like to get some objective information to look and see where the hormone levels are. Most women with fibroids are progesterone deficient, but I like to know exactly how much and what's going on with the other hormones. And then replacing it is absolutely necessary. And depending on how old you are and where you are in your reproductive cycle, it may be something that might be a long-term solution, or sometimes just a short-term solution. It's a very individual, customized approach, as I'm sure you know with your patients. I don't want to give a one-size-fits-all because there really
Sure.
isn't one, but progesterone is usually a key component of a treatment plan.
Right. Okay. Well, I'd love to talk a little bit about, actually, were you done with the nutritional deficiency part?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay. I'd love to talk a little bit more about the deeper sort of spiritual aspects of it that you had earlier mentioned.
Sure. So for me, those intangibles, the thoughts, feelings, and beliefs that we have in our spiritual connection really form the backbone of the physical body. So everybody's familiar with acupuncture and meridians of how the energy flows throughout the body, and that acupuncture points access these energy flows and release blocks in this energy flow. Well, these meridians are part of the structure of the energetic body that's actually larger than our physical body. And our physical body is actually a manifestation of this energetic body. So just like the foundation and the framing of your house determines the structural integrity of your home, right? Our energetic framing of our physical body determines our health. So you've got to look at that. And there are a lot of tools now that can be used to look at it. Zyto is one I can think of, as well as acupuncture. But some of the intangibles that we look at have to do with the things you can't see, touch, smell, taste, hear, feel, right? So our thoughts and our beliefs. And then there's also the, if anyone's read Anatomy of the Spirit by Carolyn Mace, she goes into great detail about what the anatomy is of this energetic body. And she talks about the chakras in there. And so the uterus is in the second chakra, the sacral chakra, reproductive chakra. And so it really is the seat of creativity. And it is the seat of what we produce in this world. So it can produce physical life, as in making children, making babies. But also it has to do with what we create in the world, with our minds, with our bodies, whether it's dance that we want to create, or we're a writer and we want to write books, or maybe we're a teacher and we want to teach. So whatever it is that we bring forth in the world has to do with that second chakra. So one of the main things that I like to look at with women who have fibroids is, what is it that you're wanting to create that you're not creating? Because energy is never created or destroyed. It only transmutes. And so you've got to funnel that creative energy in that second chakra in a healthy way into healthy outlets, or it's going to bind up on itself and create tumors. So fibroid tumors are often a sign that there is blocked energy in creating externally in the world, and that energy is turning back on itself and creating tumors inside. So one exercise that I always have women with fibroids do is to journal about what they have, what dreams they have for creating that they're not listening to, they're not heeding. So most people are not aware that those little inklings that you get about, oh, maybe I'd like to write a book, or, oh, maybe I'd like to learn how to trim bonsai trees, or whatever it is, those little thoughts that you have, that's your soul speaking to you.
Right.
About something that it wants. And we're so accustomed to, when we're kids, we're socialized to cut that off, you know. We'll say, oh, I want to be president of the United States. Oh, you can't do that. You're a girl. No girl's ever been president of the United States. And so we say, you can't do that. Well, by the time we're in high school, most of us have so internalized these external voices about what we can't do and what we can't expect and how we can't flourish, that it becomes this inner voice that shuts us off and creates resistance, instead of when we hear that voice, oh, I want to, like I always have loved TED Talks, and years ago heard about them, and I listen to them all the time, and I share them with my list and my social media. And I was like, I would really like to do a TED Talk. And instead of saying, because I kind of was taught when I was younger, you can do whatever it is you feel called to do. I put that in my, that I was going to do that one day. And now I've been invited, and in June, I'm going to give a TED Talk.
Amazing.
So, yeah. So, whereas a lot of people probably, see other people doing those things and they think, oh, I can't do that because fill in the blank. If you're listening, what are you telling yourself you can't do that you want to do? Anything that you want to do is your soul wanting to fulfill its mission in this world. You came here to express who you are. And if you thwart that, it's going to show up as disease in the body, dis-ease. And you're going to have symptoms. And the symptoms are not a sign that you need a birth control pill. Sorry. Stop it, guys. And the symptoms are not a sign that you need, you have a deficiency of Prozac or a birth control pill.
Exactly.
It's a sign that something needs to be attended to in your body, and there's always an energetic component to it. And for fibroids, it has to do with creativity. And so I urge everyone listening, if you've got fibroids or any female problem, if you have any uterine symptom going on, it has to do, it's speaking about your creativity in the world. Breast problems have more to do with love, but uterus, ovaries has more to do with creativity.
I don't find that women dream enough about what they want in their life. I feel like they do all the things. They're moms, they get their kids off to school, they do, go to work, come home, make dinner, and they're just really focused on everyone else and everyone else's needs. And they don't really take any time to dream enough for themselves. Do you find that?
Yes, absolutely. I think that, we do have that maternal instinct, and we have a drive, a lot of us, to have children, some not. And then we pour everything into our children. But I think that sometimes we we go a little too far. And I think we really can fall into being almost codependent with our children and trying to derive all of our satisfaction and creativity from our children and our role as mothers. And I personally don't think that that's necessarily a good role model for kids, because I see so many women who are depleted because they've given so much, they have nothing left for themselves and they lose themselves. And I know that was my story. I put everything into my kids, my family, my husband, and my work as an OBGYN, and I completely lost myself. And that's why I ended up, being obese and having chronic fatigue and fibromyalgia and looking 20 years older than I was, and my hair fell out and I had no sex drive, and I completely lost touch with who I was. And regaining, getting on the spiritual path was the first thing that happened for me, because I kept saying, there's got to be something more to life than this. I feel so empty. And I had this spiritual awakening where I got in touch with this force greater than myself that was a creative force, and that I was part of it. And then I started kind of working with it and meditating and praying and reading about it and asking, what am I here to do? Because as much as I loved delivering babies and taking care of women, at some point after I had delivered thousands of babies and done surgeries and just done it for over a decade, I said, there's got to be something more. And I also had realized that not only was my own health suffering and I couldn't fix it, but a lot of the women who I saw, who I treated with the way I was taught, like we discussed in the beginning, with birth control pills, hormones, and hysterectomies, they never really got better. So you end up taking a uterus out, but they never really became healthy and flourished and became vitally alive. And I'm like, what are we doing wrong? We're missing something here. And that's when I discovered functional medicine. And so I studied it and became fellowship trained in it. And then I retired from OB in 2011. And this is all I've done since. But it was so my story that I had lost myself. And so part of my recovering my authentic self and healing my physical body was actually saying yes to all of the things that I had wanted to do in my life and all of the talents and gifts that I was given. So public speaking, for instance, and doing the TED Talk, doing my podcast, doing YouTube videos. So everything, and I help women to understand this, everything that you've done in your life is with purpose. Nothing is lost. And all the gifts that you were given, all the things you loved to do when you were a kid and you were in grade school, if you were musical or artistic in any way, or maybe you were very scientific and you loved to examine how things were created and how they worked, or maybe you were fascinated with astronomy or astrology or fishing or whatever it is. Those are all clues as to what it is that you're meant to bring to the world. And, it's been said that if you don't bring forth what's within you, it will kill you. But if you bring forth what's within you, it will save you. And I really have found that to be true. But I do think that we can get lost in motherhood and give too much. And that sometimes having healthy boundaries with your kids and saying, okay, it's now me time, to really nourish who you are and what your unique gifts are is so vitally essential to physical healing.
Absolutely. And so how did you use functional medicine to all of what you were going through?
Yeah, so I discovered functional medicine in 2008. It was actually one of my patients. She was struggling with the same middle-aged women problems I was. And I did the standard treatments, which is, birth control pills. Oh, can't sleep. Here's a sleeping pill. Oh, you need an antidepressant, right? So most women can relate to leaving their doctor's office at midlife with 5 prescriptions, but that doesn't really address the why. And so she wasn't really getting better. And she went away and came back the next year. She looked like a new person. I saw her at the end of the hall. It's like, oh my God, what have you been doing? Because you look totally different. And she was. And she said, I went to this doctor who practices this thing called functional medicine. Oh, what's that? So I looked into it. And I started learning about it. And as I would learn about the different tests, I would do them. And even though I had checked my thyroid, I don't know, at least 10 times, and it was quote unquote normal, I didn't know that I wasn't doing the right tests as a mainstream physician, and I wasn't reading them the right way. And so when I learned how to read them properly, I did have low functioning thyroid. And I find that's true for about 80% of the women I see. And then I learned about salivary cortisol testing, and I did that. And oh my gosh, I was a flatline cortisol. And, I learned about food sensitivity testing and functional stool testing. And so I would learn about these tests. I would do them. I actually worked with a naturopath, and I used all natural treatments. And it was like Hansel and Gretel following the breadcrumb trail. I started getting better and better. And after 2 years, I had lost 100 pounds, and I looked 20 years younger, and I felt great and off all prescription medications. And of course, my patients who were middle-aged women with the same problems, like, what are you doing? You look great. We want that. So I started doing it with them. And then, like we talked about earlier, these appointments are very long, a lot of education. And, I was basically doing my 5 to 10 visit traditional appointments and then doing my functional visits. But I was telling all my regular patients, well, you've got fibroids, and my board certification says that you need to take this birth control pill, and we need to do surgery and things like that.
Right.
That's not really what you want. You want to come see me on the days I do functional medicine, and we want to check your hormone levels, and we want to do a natural approach so we can heal you naturally. And they're like, yeah. So I have yet to find a woman who, when you educate her on the options, doesn't choose a functional approach. And so they were all coming to see me in my functional practice. And then after a couple of years, I just said, I don't feel in integrity even having a regular practice anymore. And so I retired from OBGYN, and I've done this full time since.
Oh, so amazing. What was the year? So the year that you were sick was the year that you had found out about functional medicine?
I found out about it in 2008, but I had been sick for years.
Okay.
So I really was struggling with this. But it's interesting because when I started working with women doing this type of medicine, what I noticed is there's some people, like a third of women, will take the information, you educate them, they get it, their lives are changed forever, health improves, they never look back. And then there are other women who they get it and they do it for a while, and then they fall off. And even though they understand it and they get it, they don't seem to be able to do it. And then there's a third that really can never really get it and never do it. So I started saying, like, what is going on here? And what I realized is the energetic spiritual piece. So not all functional medicine doesn't necessarily integrate the energetic body or spiritual piece. So if you go to any functional medicine practitioner, they're not necessarily going to talk to you about that. I talk about it, and I know you do, because what I realized is that I had this spiritual awakening in 2004, which is what prepared me to be open to receive this information, follow it, and use it, and had already started healing my energetic body and energetic system. And so that's when I started incorporating the energy work into my protocols and my practice, because I really think it's essential. I know it's essential. If you don't address it, you may get some improvement physically, but you'll probably never get it where you want it to be.
Yeah, completely. Wow, this has been so great. Was there anything that we missed? Anything that you wanted to add at all about fibroids?
No, I think it's been really comprehensive. I just would say to anyone listening who is suffering with fibroids, there is another way from the traditional way. The pharmaceutical hormones, you do need to beware, because They are not the same as your body's natural hormones. They are chemically altered so that drug companies can get patents on them so that they can make a profit to pay for the research that they had to do to get it approved by the FDA. Well, these sit on the hormone receptors, but they don't stimulate them the same way your natural hormones do. And so, as evidenced by Prempro, increasing the risk of all kinds of diseases, including breast cancer in menopausal women. So birth control pills, for instance, the earlier you go on them, and if you're on them for over 10 years, your risk of breast cancer is increased. So they do have some health benefits, but they are a toxin in your body. So when it comes to a functional approach, it's something that you need to be aware of. And most women who are on birth control or hormonal suppression actually have the hormone profile of a menopausal woman. And that has consequences. I recently did a podcast on my podcast episode about this, that most women aren't aware of, and most women don't have informed consent. Their doctor, if you're listening and you're on birth control pills or Depo-Provera or some type of synthetic hormone, how many of you, your doctor really went into detail about these are the risks involved with taking these? How many really have informed consent? Usually not many. And I know when I practiced regular OBGYN, I just, here, take this. We didn't have any form like with surgery that people would sign. So I just would want women to be aware of that. I would also say educate yourself about minimally invasive options. You really don't want to get rid of your uterus if you can help it. Most women are not aware that it's considered your second heart in your body. In Chinese medicine, it's your second heart. And I find that most women who've had a hysterectomy never really feel completely whole after they have it. And I think that it has to do with these energetic and creative components that we're talking about in this energetic body. And so really see what methods you can use naturally, holistically to heal your body. My mom healed herself from fibroids. She was a real granola girl growing up in New York City, when I grew up in New York City, and healed herself from fibroids, doing some of the things we're talking about. But, I went off to medical school and I thought I knew better. I told her mother, we heal with steel. And, when you're board certified and you're told that you know everything about women's health, then you become closed off. But then when I came back to my own health path and discovered functional medicine, I went back to my mom and I was like, you were right. You were right. So I think she planted those seeds and then they had to germinate. And so like they say, experience is what teaches. It's not necessarily literature or hearing someone else. And so I had to have my own experience with it to now know the truth about healing.
Wow. What an amazing story. Thank you so much for today's interview and sharing all of what you know about fibroids and treating them naturally and your journey and everything. So I really appreciate you. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you so much for having me, Margaret. It's my pleasure.
Well, I hope you enjoy this conversation. And next time you see your doctor, see if they are open to any of these suggestions, though they may or may not know how to, do all of the testing, especially the hormone testing, and they may only know how to look at blood work. So really important to find a trained functional medicine or naturopath to help you with this. And if you want to learn more about Dr. Dunston and for all the show notes, head on over to margaretromero.com/episode 127. Well, thank you again for listening this week. I so appreciate you wherever you are in this world. Much love, big hugs, and we'll talk to you next week. Bye for now.